May has always carried a strange kind of weight for me. It's the month when everything begins to bloom, yet it also holds the sharp memory of endings. 3 years ago, on a cool morning in early May, Mark didn't come home. He loved the sea. It was part of what drew us to this house, perched on the cliffs where the Atlantic stretches endlessly, its colors shifting with the mood of the sky. Mark had this way of making everything seem solid, unshakable, like the tides themselves. I never imagined the water would take him from me. That morning started like so many others. I remember he'd kissed me on the forehead before heading down to the dock, his thermos of coffee in hand and a light jacket thrown over his shoulder. He said he'd be back by lunch. Just a quick trip out to check the lobster traps he'd been tinkering with all spring. He was always tinkering, always finding little projects to keep his hands busy. When noon came and went, I wasn't worried. Mark had a way of losing track of time when he was out on the water. But by late afternoon, the unease had started creeping in. I called his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. I told myself the signal was just spotty, as it often was along the coast. By evening, the light had turned golden, and the water was calm, but there was no sign of his boat. I called the harbor master, and soon enough, a search party was organized. They combed the shoreline, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness, while I stood on the porch, staring out at the black expanse of sea, waiting for someone to tell me it was all a mistake. When they finally found the boat, overturned and battered, I remember thinking it couldn't possibly be his. Mark was too careful, too experienced. He'd been on the water his whole life, he knew its rhythms, its dangers. But the boat was his and Mark wasn't with it. They said it was likely a rogue wave, something sudden and unpredictable. The kind of freak accident you can't prepare for. I didn't know whether to be angry at the sea or at Mark for underestimating it. In the end, the anger gave way to something else, something heavier and harder to carry. For weeks after, I couldn't look at the water without feeling like it was mocking me. How could it still be so beautiful, so unchanged, when it had stolen everything from me? The sound of the waves that used to lull me to sleep now felt deafening. It was as though the sea had taken him and left me with nothing but its relentless, endless presence. The funeral was small, just close friends and a few neighbors from town. I barely remember what anyone said. The whole day felt like a blur, like I was moving through a fog I couldn't shake. People told me I was strong, but I didn't feel it. I felt hollow. The kind of hollow you can't fill with condolences or casseroles, or even the passing of time. After Mark was gone, I tried to return to Boston. That's where we'd lived for most of our marriage, where we'd raised Matthew. But the city felt suffocating without him. Every street, every cafe, every familiar corner seemed to whisper his name. Eventually, I packed up what was left of our life there and came back to the house on the bluff. It wasn't easy. The first few months, I could barely step outside. The wind off the ocean felt too sharp, the house too quiet. But slowly I started to find a rhythm. I converted the barn into a studio, something Mark had always wanted me to do, but I'd never had time for. The work kept my hands busy and my mind focused. I started teaching classes, small groups at first, just a few locals who'd heard about the widow on the bluff making pottery. Watching others shape the clay, coaxing it into something both fragile and strong, felt oddly therapeutic. It reminded me that life could still be molded, even after it felt broken beyond repair. But even with the studio, the garden, and the routines I'd built for myself, there are nights when the silence feels unbearable. I'll sit by the window with a cup of tea, staring out at the dark sea, and feel this ache, this longing for the life we had. It wasn't perfect. Mark and I argued like anyone else, and we had our share of struggles. But it was ours, and now it's just me. Matthew calls occasionally, but not often. He's busy with his life in New York, his work, his deadlines, his relationships, or whatever else he's wrapped up in. I understand. I really do. I was his age once, too, caught up in the whirlwind of trying to make something of myself. But sometimes I wonder if he even remembers this place, this house where he grew up, where he learned to ride a bike and build sandcastles down by the beach. It's been months since I last saw him, and though I'd never say it out loud, I miss him. The distance between us feels like another kind of loss, quieter but no less painful. These days, I find comfort in small things. The way the sunlight filters through the studio windows, the wildflowers swaying in the breeze, the steady hum of the potter's wheel. The sea still intimidates me, but I've learned to live alongside it. It's not something you can fight after all. You can only learn to coexist, to find your own rhythm in its unending tide. This is my life now, quiet and simple, built on the remnants of what once was. It's not the life I imagined for myself, but it's the one I've made. And as I look out at the horizon, where the water meets the sky in a soft blur, I tell myself that's enough. For today it's enough. It was one of those breezy afternoons when the light danced on the waves, and the air smelled faintly of salt and blooming wild roses. I was in the garden, crouched low over a patch of goldenrod, trying to pull out stubborn weeds without disturbing the roots. My hands were caked with dirt, and the wind kept tugging strands of hair loose from my ponytail when I heard it, the crunch of gravel on the driveway. I straightened up, my back protesting from the sudden movement, and turned toward the sound. I wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors out here were rare. Shielding my eyes from the sun, I saw a car pull in, and a moment later, the door swung open. Matthew. For a moment, I couldn't quite believe it. My son, my Matthew, was standing there, looking so much older than I'd remembered. He was taller, broader in the shoulders, and his face carried a seriousness I wasn't used to seeing. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his suit jacket was rumpled, like he'd slept in it. He held a single duffel bag, and his tie was stuffed haphazardly into the top, dangling out as if he'd tossed it there in a rush. Matthew, I called, my voice catching slightly. He turned toward me, offering a lopsided smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Hey, Mom. I dropped the gloves I'd been wearing and walked toward him, still trying to process the sight of him here unannounced. When I got close enough, I reached up to touch his face, brushing a strand of his dark hair away from his forehead. He hadn't shaved in a few days, and the stubble made him seem so grown up, so far from the boy who used to run barefoot through the wildflowers. You're here, I said softly, my voice trembling just a little. Yeah, he said, his voice low. I hope that's okay. Of course it's okay, I said quickly, pulling him into a hug. He smelled faintly of cologne and city air, a sharp contrast to the salt and earth that clung to everything here. He hugged me back, but it was brief, hesitant, like he wasn't used to this kind of closeness anymore. When I pulled back, I did something I hadn't done in years. I leaned up and kissed his cheek, just lightly, the way I used to when he was a boy. His skin was warm, and I could feel the faintest hint of stubble against my lips. You've grown, I said, the words slipping out without thought. I reached out, smoothing the crease on the shoulder of his jacket. I mean, I know you're an adult, but seeing you now, I trailed off, shaking my head. You're so much taller than I remember. When did that happen? He laughed softly, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of the boy he used to be. I haven't grown since I was 19, Mom. Well, you seem taller, I said with a shrug, brushing some imaginary lint off his sleeve. His smile faded slightly, and he glanced past me toward the house. It's been a while, hasn't it? It has, I said, stepping aside so he could follow me toward the porch. Come on, let's get you inside. Matthew carried his bag up the steps, and I couldn't help but notice the way he moved. Strong, purposeful, but with a heaviness in his shoulders. It was like he was carrying something far more than the contents of that duffel bag. Inside, the house felt smaller with him in it, though not in an unpleasant way. It had been so long since I'd had anyone else here, and the sight of him standing in the entryway made the space feel alive in a way it hadn't for years. I wasn't expecting company, I said lightly, trying to break the tension. But I can fix you something to eat if you're hungry. He shook his head. I'm fine. Just tired. I nodded, studying his face again. There was a shadow in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place, and it tugged at my heart. The guest room is ready, I said, motioning toward the hallway. Go put your things down, get some rest. We'll talk later. Thanks, he said, his voice soft. As he disappeared down the hall, I stood there for a moment, feeling an odd mix of emotions. I was thrilled to see him, of course, but also struck by how much he had changed. He wasn't my little boy anymore, the one who used to cling to my hand and tell me about his school day in breathless detail. He was a man now, confident, self-assured, but also something else. Something I couldn't quite name yet. That evening, I knocked softly on his door, a plate of sandwiches and an apple balanced in my hand. "Matthew, come in," he said, his voice muffled. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his tie still draped over the duffel bag and his laptop open beside him. The sight of him there, in this house where he'd grown up, tugged at something deep inside me. "You should eat," I said, setting the plate on the nightstand. "You look like you haven't had a decent meal in days." He smiled faintly. "Thanks." I hesitated, my hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "You know you don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to, right? But if you need to talk, I'm here." The days had begun to take on a quiet, steady rhythm, each one blending into the next. Matthew's presence, though unexpected, had slipped seamlessly into the fabric of my life here. I could see him beginning to relax, but there was still a tension beneath the surface, a heaviness he carried that he hadn't yet shared with me. It happened on an afternoon that felt like any other. I was in the garden, moving pots of herbs closer to the porch. The sun was warm on my back, and the scent of rosemary and thyme filled the air. I decided that my lavender needed more space, and was lifting a heavy ceramic pot when my foot caught on the edge of the path. The fall was sudden, jarring. My ankle twisted awkwardly, and I landed hard, the pot shattering beside me. Pain shot through my leg, sharp and immediate, as I clutched my ankle and tried to steady my breathing. Before I could fully register what had happened, I heard Matthew's voice. He was already running toward me from the porch, his face pale with alarm. He was at my side in an instant, crouching down and resting his hands on my shoulders. His touch was firm but gentle, steadying me as I tried to sit up. I could see the worry etched into his face, the way his eyes darted to my ankle and then back to my face, as if searching for any sign that it was worse than it looked. Without a word, he slipped one arm around my back and the other under my knees, lifting me effortlessly. I tried to protest, mumbling something about being fine, but the pain in my ankle said otherwise. He carried me to the car, his grip secure, his jaw set with a determination that silenced any further arguments. The ride to the clinic was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and my occasional hisses of pain when the car hit a bump. I could feel his tension, the way his hands gripped the wheel just a little too tightly, his eyes flicking toward me every so often. At the clinic, the doctor's examination was swift but thorough. He poked and prodded at my ankle, making me wince, before finally delivering the verdict. A mild sprain. Nothing broken, no serious damage, just rest, ice, and elevation. Matthew seemed to relax at those words, the tightness in his shoulders easing just a little. But he didn't let his guard down completely, not until we were back home. He helped me out of the car and into the house, his arm steadying me as I limped toward the couch. Once I was settled with my leg propped up on a pillow, he disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with an ice pack and a glass of water. I watched him as he knelt by the couch, carefully arranging the ice pack on my ankle. There was something so tender, so unguarded about the way he cared for me that it made my chest ache. As he adjusted the ice pack, his hand brushed against mine, and I reached out impulsively, resting my fingers on his shoulder. The fabric of his shirt was warm from the sun, and I could feel the strength in him, the quiet resilience of a man who had faced more than he let on. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me then, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment, something shifted. The space between us seemed to dissolve, and I saw not just my son but the man he had become, strong, steady, and deeply caring. Without thinking, I leaned toward him, and he moved closer too, as if drawn by the same unseen force. It was instinctual, natural, and before I knew it, my lips brushed against his. It was soft at first, a fleeting touch that lingered longer than I expected. When I pulled back, my heart was racing, and I saw the surprise in his eyes mirrored by my own. But instead of pulling away, he leaned in again, his hand brushing against my cheek as he kissed me. This time, it was deeper, more certain, and it left me breathless. The kiss ended as quietly as it had begun, and he rested his forehead against mine for a moment, his hand still on my shoulder. There was a vulnerability in his expression that I hadn't seen before, a raw honesty that made my chest tighten. I didn't know what to say or how to process what had just happened, but the warmth in his gaze told me that we didn't need words, not yet. That night, as I lay on the couch with my leg propped up and the house bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, I couldn't stop replaying that moment in my mind. It had been so unexpected, so utterly unlike anything I had imagined. But as strange and confusing as it was, there was no denying the connection we had shared. It was something fragile and new, something that made me feel both exhilarated and terrified all at once. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to hope that this visit might heal more than just my ankle. That night, the house felt quieter than usual, even though Matthew was just down the hall. I stayed on the couch, my ankle elevated and wrapped in an ice pack, but my thoughts were far from my injury. My mind kept replaying what had happened in the garden and later, here in the living room. The kiss had been unplanned, unexpected, and yet it had felt natural. There was no way to explain it, no logic to unravel it. It wasn't just the physicality of it, though I could still feel the warmth of his lips, the gentleness of his touch. It was the emotion behind it, the way it seemed to carry a weight of unspoken feelings, of connection that had been buried beneath years of distance and grief. I drifted into a restless sleep on the couch, only to wake hours later to the soft creak of floorboards. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. I turned my head just in time to see Matthew standing at the edge of the living room, a glass of water in his hand. For a moment he hesitated, as if unsure whether to come closer. Then he crossed the room, setting the glass down on the side table next to me. He knelt beside the couch, his eyes scanning my face. "You should be asleep," he murmured, his voice low but steady. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Not with the way his presence seemed to fill the room, the way his nearness made my chest tighten. His hand moved to adjust the blanket over my legs, and his fingers brushed against my skin, light and fleeting but enough to make me shiver. He must have noticed because his gaze softened, and without warning he leaned in. His lips found mine again, and this time there was no hesitation, no questioning. The kiss was deeper, fuller, carrying an intensity that made my pulse quicken. His hand cupped the side of my face, his thumb brushing my cheek as he tilted his head slightly, deepening the connection. I couldn't help but respond, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as I kissed him back. Time seemed to stand still, the world outside the room fading away until there was nothing but the warmth of his lips, the steady weight of his hand on my face, and the quiet hum of something unspoken passing between us. When the kiss finally broke, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting together. His hand lingered on my cheek for a moment longer before he pulled back, his eyes searching mine. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly as if to say, "I'm here. I understand." He stayed there for a while, sitting on the floor beside the couch, his hand still clasped in mine. We didn't speak, but the silence wasn't heavy. It felt comforting, like a shared understanding that didn't need to be put into words. Eventually he stood, his fingers trailing from mine as he stepped away. "Good night," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, before retreating down the hall to his room. I lay awake long after he was gone, my thoughts spinning. There was no denying what had just happened, nor the depth of feeling behind it. It scared me, how easily the boundaries between us seemed to blur, but it also stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in years, a sense of being seen, of being cared for in a way I hadn't even realized I'd been missing. As I finally drifted back to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring, and whether we could navigate this fragile, unspoken thing between us without breaking it. The days had passed in a blur of quiet moments, shared laughter, and unspoken understanding. I had grown accustomed to Matthew's presence in a way I hadn't anticipated. It felt as though the house, once silent and still, had come alive again, his energy filling every room, every corner. And yet, despite the connection that had blossomed between us, there was always the unspoken knowledge that this time together, fragile and fleeting as it was, had an expiration date. The morning of his departure arrived too quickly. I woke to find the house bathed in a soft, hazy light, the ocean breeze stirring the curtains in the kitchen. Matthew was already up, packing the last of his things into the duffel bag by the door. There was a quiet finality in the air, a weight that neither of us spoke of aloud. I made breakfast as usual, eggs, toast, coffee, but the ritual felt different today, like the last page of a book I didn't want to close. Matthew moved around the kitchen with a calm efficiency, but there was a sadness in his eyes, a quiet sorrow that matched my own. We ate together, but the conversation was lighter than usual, the silences between us stretching longer than they had in days. When breakfast was done, Matthew went upstairs to finish his packing. I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up, the sound of the water running in the sink mingling with the soft hum of the house. I heard the door to the guest room open, and a few moments later, Matthew appeared in the hallway, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there looking at me, as though unsure what to say. I could feel my chest tightening as I wiped my hands on a towel. The lump in my throat made it hard to speak. For so long, this house had been just mine, a quiet refuge from the world. But now, with him standing there was a sense of loss already beginning to settle in my chest. I walked toward him slowly, each step heavier than the last. When I reached him, I placed a hand on his arm, the familiar warmth of his skin under my fingers somehow comforting and painful all at once. "Take care of yourself, Matthew," I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper. "You've got a lot ahead of you." He nodded, his jaw tight as he reached up to touch my face, his thumb brushing over my cheek. The gesture was tender, but there was a certain finality to it, as if we both knew that this moment marked the end of something. "I'll be okay, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll miss this. I'll miss you." I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the vulnerability that he tried so hard to hide. But in that moment, I didn't want to reassure him with empty words. Instead, I reached up and cupped his face in both my hands, holding him for a long moment, feeling the pulse of life beneath his skin, the warmth of him. Then, without thinking, I leaned forward, my lips finding his once more. It was a kiss that felt different from all the others, a kiss that carried the weight of everything we had shared and everything we hadn't yet said. It was gentle, but full of all the emotions that had been building between us over the past few days. When we pulled apart, neither of us spoke. There were no words left to say. Instead, I pressed my forehead to his, and for a long moment, we just stood there, holding each other, the quiet hum of the house wrapping around us. Finally, Matthew took a step back, looking at me with a mix of tenderness and sadness. "I'll come back, Mom. I promise." I nodded, my heart aching, but a small, hopeful part of me knew that this time he would. He picked up his duffel bag and turned toward the door, but before he reached it he paused. Without looking back, he spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I love you, Mom." And with that he was gone. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty doorway, the sound of the waves crashing in the distance. There was an ache in my chest, a hollow space that his absence had left behind. But in that ache, there was also something else, a quiet, lingering warmth. I would hold on to that warmth, that connection, for as long as I could, and maybe, just maybe, it would carry us both through the distance and time between us,